Ignoring the warnings of those around him, a millionaire decides to employ a woman others have unjustly judged. Her presence in his household leads to remarkable occurrences that leave skeptics astonished and reevaluating their biases. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The elegant conference room on the 47th floor of Stevens Enterprises buzzed with tension. Mark Stevens sat at the head of the mahogany table, his fingers drumming against its polished surface as he listened to the increasingly heated discussion among his board members. The afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows highlighted the discomfort on his face. "Mark, you can't be serious about this hire," Thomas Richardson, the CFO, stated flatly. "A black housekeeper? Have you considered how this might affect your standing in the community?" His words hung heavy in the air, met with murmurs of agreement from several other board members. Mark maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened. "I wasn't aware I needed board approval for household staff," he responded, his voice level but firm. The meeting had derailed from its intended purpose of discussing quarterly projections to scrutinizing his personal hiring decisions. "We're merely concerned about optics," Patricia Henderson chimed in, adjusting her designer glasses. "The Upper East Side has certain expectations. Your position as CEO requires maintaining specific social standards." Mark stood up, straightening his tie. "The meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene tomorrow to discuss actual business matters." His tone left no room for argument, though he could see the disapproval on his colleagues' faces as they gathered their materials. Later that evening, alone in his study, Mark found himself staring at an old photograph. It showed his childhood home in Queens, where his parents had run a small grocery store. The image captured a young Mark sitting on the store steps with Jimmy, the son of their Nigerian neighbors who had become his best friend. The photograph reminded him of his father's words, "Character isn't determined by color, son. It's built through actions." His parents had taught him to judge people by their merit, not their appearance. Despite moving up in the world, he had never forgotten those lessons. The pressure from his board members felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. The next morning, Mark sat across from Michelle Taylor in his home office. She sat straight-backed in the chair, her resume placed neatly on the desk between them. Her qualifications were impressive: a degree in art history, experience managing high-end households, and references that spoke volumes about her character. "Ms. Taylor, your credentials are excellent," Mark began, noting how she maintained steady eye contact. "But I'm more interested in hearing your perspective on what you believe you could bring to this position." Michelle hesitated briefly before speaking. "Mr. Stevens, I understand the unique position this role presents. I'm not just applying to manage your household. I see this as an opportunity to challenge perceptions and create positive change, even in small ways. Could you elaborate?" Mark leaned forward, intrigued. "Your home often hosts business gatherings and social events. Every interaction, every detail matters. I believe in creating an environment that not only reflects excellence, but also promotes inclusion and understanding. It's about proving through actions that capability and character aren't bound by color." Mark nodded, impressed by her candor. "There will be challenges," he warned. "Not everyone in my social circle shares my views on equality." "I'm well aware, Mr. Stevens," Michelle replied with a slight smile. "I've faced those challenges my entire life. But change doesn't happen by avoiding difficult situations. It happens when people are willing to stand there, ground, and prove prejudices wrong through excellence." The conviction in her voice resonated with Mark. He saw in her the same determination he'd witnessed in his own parents years ago. Despite the potential backlash, he knew he was making the right decision. "When can you start?" he asked, extending his hand. Michelle's smile widened as she shook his hand firmly. "I'm available immediately, Mr. Stevens." As she left his office, Mark felt a mixture of certainty and apprehension. He had just challenged the status quo of his social circle, and he knew there would be consequences. But looking at his parents' photograph one more time, he felt confident in his choice. Sometimes doing the right thing meant facing opposition head-on. The morning Michelle started her work began with awkward silence. Mark watched from his home office as she familiarized herself with the sprawling penthouse apartment. Her footsteps echoed through the marble floors as she took inventory of each room, making notes on her tablet. The space, while luxurious, had always felt sterile to Mark. Designer furniture filled the rooms, but everything seemed placed according to a catalog rather than actual living. He'd hired decorators before, but none had managed to make it feel like home. "Mr. Stevens," Michelle called from the living room. "Would you mind if I made some adjustments to the layout?" She stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, gesturing at the massive leather sectional that faced away from the city view. "Go ahead," he responded, curious about her vision. "And please call me Mark." Over the next few hours, Mark found himself periodically stepping out of his office to observe the transformation. Michelle moved with purpose, rearranging furniture to create conversation areas that took advantage of natural light. She repositioned art pieces, adjusting their height and grouping them in ways that told visual stories. "This piece," she explained, pointing to an abstract painting he'd bought at auction, "works better here because it catches the afternoon light. It brings out the blues and creates depth you couldn't see before." She was right. The painting suddenly seemed alive in ways it hadn't before. By late afternoon, the apartment had transformed. The space felt welcoming, sophisticated without being pretentious. Mark noticed how Michelle had incorporated elements from his travel photographs into the decor, creating personal touches throughout the apartment. "I noticed you have quite a collection of African art," she mentioned while preparing coffee in the kitchen. "But they were all hidden in your study." Mark accepted the coffee cup she offered. "Those were gifts from Jimmy's family, my childhood friend I mentioned during the interview. His father was an art dealer specializing in West African pieces. They tell beautiful stories," Michelle said, leaning against the counter. "They deserve to be seen, not tucked away in a room where no one can appreciate them." A delivery arrived, plants Michelle had ordered. "Greenery brings life to spaces," she explained, positioning a fiddle leaf fig near the window. "It also improves air quality and mental well-being." As the day progressed, the initial tension dissolved. Mark found himself sharing stories about his business trips, while Michelle offered insights about art and design that made him see his possessions in a new light. "New York has a way of making people build walls," Michelle remarked, adjusting a throw pillow. "Everyone's so focused on projecting an image that they forget to create spaces where they can actually live." Mark laughed, surprising himself. "That's painfully accurate. I've lived here for 5 years, and this is the first time it's felt like more than just an expensive hotel room." "Speaking of New York," Michelle smiled, "have you ever noticed how everyone here has their secret spot? Their favorite hidden deli or park bench? Mine's a hot dog cart on 43rd Street, Mark admitted. "Ted, my board would have a fit if they knew their CEO regularly sneaks street food for lunch." Michelle burst out laughing. "Mine's worse. There's this tiny Dominican place in Washington Heights. The health department would probably shut it down if they found it, but they make the best mango you've ever tasted." They shared a moment of genuine amusement, the kind that breaks down barriers and establishes real connections. Mark realized it had been a long time since he'd had such an honest conversation in his own home. "You know," Michelle said, growing slightly more serious, "this city can be incredibly lonely despite being packed with people. Sometimes all it takes is making spaces where people can be themselves." As evening approached, Mark surveyed his transformed apartment. The space now reflected a perfect balance between sophistication and comfort. More importantly, it felt authentic. "Thank you," he said sincerely, not just for the changes to the apartment, but for bringing some real conversation into it. Michelle nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest shifts in perspective. The Harvard Club's dining room hummed with quiet conversation and the clink of silverware against fine china. Mark sat across from Richard Bennett, his friend of 20 years and fellow CEO, watching the older man's face darken as their conversation progressed. "Have you lost your mind, Mark?" Richard's whisper carried the sharp edge of disapproval. "A black housekeeper? In your position?" He cut into his steak with unnecessary force, his signet ring catching the light. "Michelle is more than qualified," Mark responded, keeping his voice steady. "She's transformed the apartment in ways no previous staff member could." Richard leaned forward, his gray eyes narrowing. This isn't about qualifications. It's about appearances, reputation. Do you know what people are saying? That you're trying to make some sort of political statement. I wasn't aware hiring based on merit was political. Don't be naive, Richard scoffed. These people always have an agenda. Mark, I've known you since you started in this business. I vouched for you at the country club. Don't throw away everything you've built for some misguided attempt at social justice. The words these people hung in the air like smoke, making Mark's stomach turn. What exactly are you implying about Michelle? Richard dabbed his mouth with his napkin, the gesture deliberately slow. Let's just say I've heard things. About items going missing in houses where she's worked. About her sudden departures from previous positions. Have you done a thorough background check? Mark felt the first flicker of doubt, despite himself. Of course I did. Her references were impeccable. References can be manipulated, Richard shrugged. I'm just looking out for you, old friend. People like her, they're good at playing the long game. The seed of suspicion, once planted, began to take root. Mark found himself watching Michelle more closely over the next few days, noting every time she handled valuable items or entered his study. He hated himself for it, but Richard's words echoed in his mind. One evening, as Michelle was organizing his art collection, Mark couldn't contain his unease any longer. She was carefully handling an expensive Nigerian mask when he spoke. "Michelle, I need to be direct about something," he began, watching her set down the mask with professional care. "There are rumors circulating about your previous employment." Michelle's hands stilled. She turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. "I see. I don't want to believe them," Mark continued, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "But as my friend pointed out, there's a lot at stake here." "Your friend," Michelle said quietly. "Would that be Richard Bennett?" Mark's surprise must have shown on his face because Michelle gave a bitter smile. "Mr. Stevens, I'm going. To be equally direct with you," she said, straightening her spine. "Richard Bennett has been trying to discredit me for years. I worked for his sister's family until I reported their son for harassment. Instead of addressing the issue, they terminated my employment and began spreading rumors." She reached in her bag and pulled out a folder. "These are the police reports I filed, the text messages I saved, and statements from other staff members. I keep them ready because I knew eventually someone would listen to his lies." Mark took the folder, shame washing over him. The documentation was thorough, telling a story not of theft or manipulation, but of a woman who stood up against abuse and paid the price for it. "I don't blame you for having doubts," Michelle continued, her voice steady but hurt. "But I had hoped you would come to me first, before letting someone else's prejudice cloud your judgment." Mark set down the folder, the weight of his mistake heavy in his chest. "I'm sorry, Michelle. I should have trusted my own judgment instead of listening to gossip." "Trust is earned," she replied, "but it's also given. If we're going to continue working together, we need to be clear about where we stand. I'm excellent at my job, Mr. Stevens, and I have never stolen anything except perhaps the peace of mind of people who thought they could mistreat me without consequences." The honesty in her words struck Mark deeply. He realized that by entertaining Richard's insinuations, he had become part of the very system he claimed to stand against. "You're right," he said finally, "and I owe you better than this. The position is still yours if you want it. No more doubts." Michelle studied his face for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's get back to work. These pieces won't organize themselves." Michelle found Mark in his home office one evening, surrounded by charity event invitations. She set down his evening coffee and paused, gathering her courage. "Mr. Stevens, Mark, I have a proposal I'd like to discuss," she began. Mark looked up from his paperwork, gesturing for her to continue. "Instead of attending another standard charity gala, what if we created something different? Something that could actually change perspectives in this community?" She pulled out a carefully prepared presentation folder. "I've developed an idea for an art exhibition and fundraiser. One that showcases talented artists from underprivileged communities alongside established names. We could host it here in your penthouse." Mark leafed through her proposal, impressed by the detailed planning. The budget breakdowns, marketing strategies, and potential donor lists were meticulously researched. "The theme would be Bridging Worlds," Michelle explained, pointing to a mock-up of the exhibition layout. "We'd transform your apartment into a gallery space. The proceeds would fund art education programs in low-income neighborhoods." "This is impressive," Mark admitted, studying the proposed floor plan. "But you understand the risk? Many of my associates might not appreciate this departure from tradition." "That's exactly why it needs to be done," Michelle replied firmly. "These people attend the same sterile charity balls every year, writing checks to feel good about themselves. This would force them to engage with the reality of the communities they claim to help." Over the next few weeks, they threw themselves into the preparations. Michelle's art world connections proved invaluable, bringing in emerging artists eager for exposure. Mark leveraged his business network to secure sponsorships and media coverage. The penthouse gradually transformed into a professional gallery space. Michelle worked tirelessly, coordinating with artists, arranging lighting, and ensuring every detail aligned with her vision. Mark found himself increasingly invested in the project, seeing how it could bridge the gap between his corporate world and meaningful social change. "The installations will go here," Michelle explained one afternoon, gesturing to the living room. "We'll create a journey through different perspectives of New York life, from the streets to the penthouses, showing how interconnected our experiences really are." Mark watched her enthusiasm with growing admiration. "You've thought of everything." "Almost everything," she smiled. "We still need to convince your social circle to attend." That's when the first signs of trouble appeared. Richard, true to form, began his campaign of subtle sabotage. At exclusive club gatherings and private dinners, he spread doubts about the event's legitimacy. "I heard it's just a scheme to promote radical politics," he told influential board members. Mark's letting himself be used for some sort of social justice agenda. Really, it's embarrassing. The impact was immediate. Several key donors withdrew their support. Longtime associates sent polite declines to their invitations. Even some of the corporate sponsors began to waver. "People are talking," one board member warned Mark during a lunch meeting. "They're saying you've lost touch with our values, that this housemaid is leading you down a dangerous path." Michelle noticed the mounting tension, but remained focused on their goal. "We expected resistance," she reminded Mark. "Change never comes easily." One evening, as they reviewed the declining RSVP list, Mark voiced his concerns. "Maybe we should consider a more traditional approach, something less controversial." Michelle set down her tablet, fixing him with a steady gaze. "Do you know why I push for this particular format? Because art has the power to make people see beyond their prejudices. When they stand before a powerful piece, they don't immediately think about the artist's race or background. They connect with the humanity in the work first." She pulled up images of the confirmed artist's works on her tablet. "Look at these pieces. They tell stories of struggle, hope, and resilience. Stories your associates need to hear, even if they don't want to." Mark studied the artwork, seeing the truth in her words. Each piece carried messages that transcended social barriers, speaking to universal human experiences. "You're right," he finally said. "We're not backing down. If they want to judge this event before seeing it, that's their loss." "Good," Michelle nodded, relief visible in her expression. "Because I've already started installing the main pieces, and I really didn't want to take them down." The community meeting room at the Madison Avenue building filled quickly on a Wednesday evening. Mark watched from the podium as faces both familiar and new filtered in, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Michelle stood quietly to his side, her professional demeanor masking her nervousness. "Thank you all for coming," Mark began, addressing the mixed crowd of wealthy residents and participating artists. "We're here to discuss the upcoming Bridging Worlds exhibition." The room's division was visible. Established Upper East Side residents clustered on one side, artists and community organizers on the other. Richard sat in the front row, his presence a clear statement of opposition. "This is a waste of time," a woman in designer clothing interrupted. "Mr. Stevens, you're turning your residence into some sort of street fair. It'll devalue the entire building." Michelle stepped forward, her voice steady despite the hostility. "If I may address that concern?" Mark nodded, yielding the floor. "What you're calling a street fair is actually a curated exhibition featuring both established and emerging artists. Let me show you what we're planning." She began her presentation, displaying professional renderings of the transformed space. The images showed elegant installations, professional lighting designs, and sophisticated layout plans. Several audience members leaned forward, their interest piqued despite their prejudices. The exhibition will feature works from graduates of top art schools alongside self-taught talents from our community, Michelle explained, including pieces from Sarah Chun, whose work recently sold at Sotheby's for 6 figures. A murmur of recognition rippled through the crowd. Sarah Chun was a name they knew, respected. You're comparing street artists to established professionals? Richard interjected, his tone dismissive. That's hardly equivalent. Art speaks for itself. Michelle responded calmly, switching to slides of the actual pieces. I invite you to judge the work on its merit, not its origin. The room fell silent as image after image appeared on screen. The quality was undeniable. Even the skeptics found themselves studying the pieces with growing interest. An elderly resident, Mrs. Henderson, raised her hand. I recognize that piece, she said, pointing to a striking oil painting. It was featured in last month's art forum. That's part of your exhibition? Yes, Michelle confirmed. The artist grew up in the Bronx. He's now being courted by major galleries. The atmosphere began to shift. More residents asked questions about the artwork itself, rather than their preconceptions. Some even expressed interest in purchasing pieces. But Richard wasn't finished. He stood straightening his expensive jacket. This is all very pretty, but let's address the real issue. This event will bring undesirable elements into our building. The security risks alone. Every guest will be pre-registered. Mark cut in firmly. We've hired additional security. The same team that handles Met Gala events, in fact. And what about the media attention? Richard pressed. The last thing we need is reporters snooping around, painting us as elitist snobs being forced to embrace diversity. His words hung in the air, their ugly implication clear. But before either Mark or Michelle could respond, Mrs. Henderson spoke up again. Young man, she addressed Richard, her voice sharp with disapproval. I've lived in this building for 40 years. I've watched it become increasingly isolated from the very city that gives it life. Perhaps some media attention is exactly what we need. Other residents began to nod, some voicing agreement. The woman who had initially complained about property values now studied the exhibition layout with interest. I have contacts at several galleries in Chelsea, she offered tentatively. They might be interested in participating. Michelle graciously accepted the offer, maintaining her professional composure despite the victory. But Richard wasn't done. He moved through the crowd after the meeting, whispering in ears, planting seeds of doubt. Think about your reputations, he murmured to key residents. Consider what this says about our standards. Are we really going to let our building become a showcase for street art? Mark noticed the quiet conversations, saw how some residents who had seemed supportive now avoided eye contact. Richard's influence ran deep, and his campaign of whispers was just beginning. As they left the meeting, Michelle turned to Mark. We won round one, she said quietly. But Richard won't stop here. No, Mark agreed, watching his former friend disappear into a waiting car. This was just the opening move. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. 2 weeks before the exhibition, Mark noticed the subtle but unmistakable signs of Richard's influence. Confirmed guests began calling with polite excuses. Corporate sponsors cited scheduling conflicts or budget constraints. Even some of the building's initially supportive residents grew distant. In his office one evening, Mark reviewed the growing list of cancellations. The exhibition space was nearly ready. Michelle had transformed the penthouse into a sophisticated gallery, each piece perfectly placed to tell its story. But the growing isolation was palpable. The Whitneys canceled, his assistant informed him that morning. And the Henderson, they both mentioned concerns about association risks. Mark caught Michelle studying the guest list later that day, her expression carefully neutral as she noted the dwindling numbers. She had been working double time, adjusting layouts, coordinating with artists, managing logistics, all while maintaining her regular duties. Michelle, he called out, we need to talk. She joined him in his study, taking a seat across from his desk. The weight of recent events showed in the slight tension around her eyes. I'm starting to question if this was the right approach, Mark admitted. The pushback is stronger than we anticipated. Maybe we should have started smaller, tested the waters first. Michelle was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her tablet. Are you asking me to cancel the exhibition? No, I've built relationships in this community over years. Relationships that affect my business, my standing. Richard knows exactly how to leverage that. I understand, Michelle replied, her voice steady but tired. You have a lot to lose. More than I do. That's not what I meant, isn't it? She met his gaze directly. When I proposed this exhibition, I knew the risks. Not just for you, but for me. Do you think this is the first time I've watched support disappear once people realize they might have to take a real stand? She pulled up images on her tablet. The completed exhibition space, the carefully curated artwork, the stories behind each piece. Every artist in this show has faced the same choice we're facing now. Do we push forward and risk rejection? Or do we retreat to the safety of the status quo? Mark felt the weight of her words. How do you handle it? The constant pushback, the need to prove yourself over and over. By remembering that change doesn't come from comfort, she answered. Every time someone like Richard wins, it reinforces the belief that maintaining social comfort is more important than challenging injustice. Mark stood, walking to his window. The city lights sparkled below, a reminder of the vast community beyond his elite circle. I need to confront Richard, he said finally. This has gone too far. He found Richard at their club the next day, comfortable in his usual corner seat. The older man barely looked up from his paper as Mark approached. Mark, coming to your senses, finally? Stop the sabotage, Richard. This vendetta against Michelle needs to end. Richard folded his paper carefully, his expression hardening. Vendetta? I'm trying to save you from yourself. This little social experiment of yours is damaging relationships you can't afford to lose. These relationships seem pretty fragile if they can't withstand an art exhibition. Don't be naive, Richard snapped. You're challenging a system that's worked for generations. Actions have consequences, Mark. Are you prepared for them? Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. As a friend. Richard stood, straightening his tie. Cancel the exhibition. Let the girl go. Return to the way things were. And if I don't? Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then don't be surprised when doors start closing. Permanently. Mark left the club, his conversation with Richard replaying in his mind. The threat was clear, but something about Richard's intensity felt personal, almost desperate. There was more to this than simple prejudice. The morning of the exhibition arrived with a mix of anticipation and dread. Mark stood in his transformed penthouse, watching the early morning light play across the carefully arranged artwork. Despite the reduced guest list, the space looked magnificent. Michelle moved through the rooms with focused efficiency, directing the catering staff and making final adjustments to the lighting. She wore a tailored black dress, professional and elegant, though Mark noticed her hands trembling slightly as she checked her tablet. The first guests arrive in 6 hours, she said, joining. And by the window. The Times art critic confirmed they're still coming, even after Richard's calls to their editor. How many confirmations do we have? 58, she replied. Down from the original 120. But the right people are coming, gallery owners, serious collectors, community leaders. The day progressed with meticulous preparation. Security teams took their positions. Caterers set up their stations. Artists arrived early to stand near their works, ready to discuss their pieces with guests. An hour before the opening, Mark found Michelle in the makeshift staging area, staring at her reflection in a window. Her artwork, a series of powerful photographs documenting life across New York's social spectrum, occupied a central wall in the main room. Having second thoughts? He asked. Not about the exhibition, she answered, but I've never had my work displayed like this. It's different when it's your own story on the wall. Mark studied her photographs, stark, honest images that captured both struggle and dignity. They're extraordinary, Michelle. You've been an artist all along, haven't you? Photography was my first love, before life demanded more practical choices. She straightened her spine, checking her appearance one final time. Ready? The first guests began arriving at exactly 6 o'clock. Mark and Michelle greeted them in the foyer, maintaining professional composure despite the obvious absences in the crowd. Some guests seemed almost apologetic about attending, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting judgment. The exhibition space slowly filled. Conversations began tentatively, but grew more animated as guests engaged with the artwork. A prominent gallery owner spent 20 minutes discussing technique with a young artist from the Bronx. Mrs. Henderson, who had kept her RSVP despite pressure, brought friends from the art world. Michelle moved through the crowd with grace, introducing artists to collectors, explaining the stories behind pieces, building bridges between worlds that rarely intersected. Mark watched her work the room, seeing not his housekeeper, but a skilled curator bringing her vision to life. Then she took the stage for her presentation. The room quieted as she began speaking about the exhibition's theme. The invisible threads connecting all New Yorkers, the shared humanity often forgotten in the divide between penthouses and projects. Each piece here tells a story, she said, her voice steady now. Not just about struggle or success, but about the moments in between. The daily acts of courage, dignity, and hope that unite us all. As she spoke, Mark noticed movement near the entrance. Richard stood there, unexpectedly present, watching Michelle with an unreadable expression. He wasn't alone. Several of the guests who had canceled had apparently changed their minds. Michelle continued her presentation, either not noticing Richard's presence or choosing to ignore it. She guided the audience through the exhibition's narrative, highlighting how each piece contributed to the larger story. When she reached her own photographs, her voice took on a deeper resonance. These images represent moments of truth, when barriers fall away and we see each other as we really are, not defined by where we live or what we own, but by our common humanity. The audience's response was powerful. Even those who had come out of obligation found themselves moved by the authenticity of her words and the power of the artwork surrounding them. But Richard's presence cast a shadow over the success. Mark watched his old friend's face, seeing something beyond mere disapproval. There was pain there, and something that looked almost like recognition as he stared at Michelle's photographs. The exhibition was in full swing, with guests moving between artwork, engaged in animated discussions. The initial success was tangible. Several pieces already displayed discrete red dots indicating sales, including 3 of Michelle's photographs. Sarah Chun, the renowned artist whose participation had lent crucial credibility to the show, stood before a collaborative piece she'd created with a young artist from Harlem. This, she announced to a gathered group of collectors, represents the future of New York art. Raw talent meeting refined technique, creating something entirely new. Mark observed the crowd's transformation. The same people who had been hesitant to attend were now actively engaging with artists they might never have encountered otherwise. Even some who had initially canceled had arrived late, slipping in quietly after seeing positive social media posts from early attendees. Mrs. Henderson had become an unexpected champion, leading influential friends from piece to piece, her enthusiasm infectious. "Did you know," she told a prominent collector, "that the young man who created this piece taught himself digital art while working as a night security guard? Simply remarkable." The energy in the room shifted noticeably when a major gallery owner approached Michelle. "Your curation is extraordinary," he said, handing her his card. "We should discuss featuring some of these artists in our upcoming Emerging Talent Showcase." But Richard wasn't idle. He moved through the crowd like a shadow, whispering in ears, his words causing subtle ripples of discomfort. Near the bar, he engaged a group of board members. "It's all very impressive on the surface," he murmured, swirling his scotch. "But consider the precedent this sets. Today it's art from the streets. Tomorrow they'll want seats on our boards. Where does it end?" Some guests shifted uncomfortably, their earlier enthusiasm dampening. Richard pressed his advantage, moving from group to group, planting seeds of doubt. "I heard," he told one influential couple, "that some of these pieces are actually reproductions, not originals at all. Can't trust everything you see, can you?" The lie was blatant, but it served its purpose. Whispers spread. People began examining the artwork with suspicious eyes rather than appreciation. Michelle noticed a change in atmosphere. She had just finished explaining her photographic technique to an interested curator when she overheard someone questioning the authenticity of a piece. "Every work here is original," she stated firmly, joining the conversation. "Each artist has provided full documentation of their process and ownership." But Richard had moved on to his next target. He approached a group admiring one of Michelle's photographs. A powerful image of an elderly woman on her Harlem stoop, dignity emanating from every line of her face. "Interesting choice of subject matter," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, though one might question the ethics of exploiting poverty for artistic gain. Before Michelle could respond, Sarah Chin stepped forward. "The only exploitation I see," she declared, "is of people's prejudices to undermine genuine talent." The confrontation drew attention. Guests gathered, watching the tension build between the established artist and the wealthy businessman. Richard's face darkened. "Ms. Chun, surely you understand the difference between real art and social activism masquerading as culture." "I understand the difference between authentic expression and threatened privilege," Sarah replied coolly. "This exhibition represents exactly what the art world needs: fresh perspectives unconstrained by traditional gatekeeping." The room had grown quiet, the conflict now impossible to ignore. Mark moved to intervene, but Michelle reached Richard first. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion, "if you have specific concerns about the artwork, I'm happy to discuss them professionally. But I won't allow you to disparage these artists or their work with baseless accusations." Richard turned to face her, something dangerous flashing in his eyes. "You don't allow?" he asked his VO, eyes dripping with contempt. "Remember your place, girl. You're still just a help, playing at being something more." The cruelty of his words hung in the air like poison. Guests shifted uncomfortably, the evening's veneer of progress suddenly stripped away. The silence that followed Richard's words was deafening. Mark stepped forward, his face tight with controlled anger. "That's enough, Richard. Enough!" Richard laughed bitterly. "I'm just getting started. Your little experiment in social engineering needs to end." Mark moved to stand beside Michelle, who remained remarkably composed despite the public humiliation. "No, it ends now. Not the exhibition. Your interference." The gathered crowd watched intently as Mark faced his old friend. "For weeks, you've been sabotaging this event, spreading lies, manipulating people, threatening relationships. I've stood by and watched because I foolishly thought you might have legitimate concerns. But now I see what this really is: pure prejudice, nothing more." "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Richard spat. "You've let this woman infiltrate your life, your social circle, pushing an agenda. The only agenda here is art," Mark interrupted. "Art that challenges us to see beyond our comfortable bubbles. And you're terrified of that, aren't you, Richard? Terrified that people might actually start questioning the barriers you've worked so hard to maintain." Mark turned to address the crowd. "Many of you canceled your attendance because Richard suggested it would be socially or professionally risky to come. Some of you are here now, despite his threats. Look around. Look at the art. Look at the connections being made. Is this really what you're afraid of?" Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. "I've known Richard for 30 years, she said clearly, "and I've never been more disappointed. This evening has been extraordinary, not despite its diversity, but because of it." Others began to speak up. The gallery owner who had given Michelle his card stood. "I came here skeptical, I admit, but the talent in this room is undeniable. These artists deserve recognition, regardless of their background." Sarah Chin joined in. "This is exactly what the New York art scene needs: fresh perspectives, raw talent, real stories. Anyone trying to suppress that isn't protecting culture, they're stifling it." Richard's face had grown increasingly red. "You're all being manipulated. This girl, this woman," Mark cut in firmly, "is Michelle Taylor, a talented photographer and curator who has done more to bridge social divides in one evening than your decades of charity galas ever accomplished." Michelle finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Mr. Bennett, your attempts to discredit this exhibition have failed. The art speaks for itself. The connections being made here are real. Your disapproval can't change that." Mark continued, "I've spent years trying to balance success with conscience. worried about rocking the boat. But Michelle showed me that real change requires courage. It requires standing up to people like you, Richard, who use their influence to maintain divisions rather than bridge them. The crowd had grown larger, with even the catering staff pausing to watch. Mark addressed them all. This exhibition isn't just about art. It's about choosing what kind of community we want to be. One that builds walls or one that breaks them down. Richard looked around, seeing his influence crumbling. Face contorted with rage, he made one final attempt. Mark, think about your position, your future. The boards you sit on, the clubs you belong to, if those relationships depend on maintaining prejudice, then I don't want them, Mark declared. I stand with Michelle and everything this exhibition represents. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to leave, both tonight and from my life. The room erupted in applause. Guests who had been hesitant now approached the artist with genuine rest. Those who had whispered behind hands now spoke openly in support. Richard stood alone, his power evaporated. But as he turned to leave, his expression shifted from anger to something else. A look of profound pain and recognition as his eyes met Michelle's one last time. Richard's retreat was halted by his own voice, cracking with emotion. "You have her eyes," he said, turning back to face Michelle. "Your mother's eyes. I've been trying to deny it since the first day I saw you here." The room fell silent again, but differently this time, heavy with the weight of personal tragedy rather than social conflict. Michelle stepped forward, her professional composure cracking for the first time that evening. "What did you just say?" "Evelyn Taylor," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She worked as a nurse at Mount Sinai 28 years ago." The color drained from Michelle's face. "How do you know my mother's name?" Mark watched as understanding dawned across Michelle's features, followed by waves of shock, anger, and pain. "Because I'm your father," Richard said, his aristocratic facade crumbling. The young executive who fell in love with a nurse, who promised her the world, who ran away when it became too complicated. When my family threatened to disown me, when my career was at stake. Michelle's hands began to shake. "All these years, all this time, you knew who I was when I started working here?" "I recognized your name on the employment application," Richard admitted. "I thought if I could drive you away quickly, I wouldn't have to face what I'd done. Every time I saw you succeed, every time you showed your talent, your dignity, it was like facing my own cowardice." The gathered crowd stood frozen, witnesses to this raw unveiling of truth. Mark stepped closer to Michelle, offering silent support. "You abandoned us," Michelle said, her voice gaining strength. "Mom worked double shifts to put me through school. She sacrificed everything while you've spent weeks trying to destroy my career, my reputation." "I became exactly what my parents wanted," Richard said, his voice hollow. "Married the right woman, joined the right clubs, maintained the right prejudices. I buried the memory of Evelyn, so deep I almost convinced myself it never happened. Until I saw you here, living the life I was too afraid to fight for." Michelle's photographs on the wall behind them took on new meaning. Images of divided lives, of boundaries between worlds, of choices made and paths not taken. "Is that supposed to make it better?" Michelle asked. "Understanding why you're a coward doesn't excuse what you've done. Not just to me and my mother, but to everyone you've used your influence to hold back." Richard stepped toward her, hand outstretched, but Michelle backed away. "Don't," she warned. "You don't get to play father now. You had 28 years for that." "Michelle, please, my mother died last year," Michelle cut him off. "Cancer. She never stopped believing people could change, could grow. She taught me to judge others by their actions, not their background." The irony is, she was talking about people like you. The weight of this revelation settled over the room. The evening's earlier conflict about art and social barriers suddenly seemed small compared to this personal tragedy. But Michelle straightened her spine, composing herself. "You know what the difference is between us, Mr. Bennett? I took my mother's lessons and turned them into art, into action. You took your parents' prejudices and used them as shields against your own guilt." She turned to address the stunned crowd. "This exhibition is about breaking down barriers, not just social ones, but the ones we build inside ourselves out of fear. Every artist here had to overcome something to create their work. Some faced poverty, others discrimination, and some had to overcome the shame others tried to impose on them. Looking back at Richard Shideli, Ver read her final words. "I don't need your recognition or your approval. My mother made sure of that. This exhibition will continue, these artists will be seen, and these conversations will happen. Your presence or absence makes no difference anymore." Richard stood there, decades of carefully constructed pretense stripped away, facing the daughter he'd abandoned and the consequences of his choices. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the penthouse, leaving behind a legacy of prejudice that his own daughter had fought to dismantle. Mark approached Michelle as the crowd respectfully dispersed to give her space. "Are you all right?" Michelle looked at her photographs, then at the gathered artists and guests who had witnessed everything. "No," she answered honestly, "but I will be. We have an exhibition to finish." The evening continued, but with a deeper understanding of the personal costs of maintaining social barriers and the courage required to break them down. The art on the walls no longer seemed like just an exhibition. It had become a testament to resilience, to choosing truth over comfort, and to the power of facing one's past while fighting for a better future.